make another quick rant here about Democrat and Republican hypocrisy. There's a lot of that, as libertarians and anarchists know, and Democrats can point out the hypocrisy of Republicans, and Republicans can point out the hypocrisy of Democrats, but they never seem to realize their own hypocritical, self-contradictory beliefs. If they did, then they would probably be an anarchist. But a couple things. I guess I'll add a disclaimer is that I'm not saying that, excuse me, yawning over here. I'm not saying that everybody who considers himself a Democrat or Republican believes these particular pairings of contradictory beliefs. But in my experience, by and large, the ones who say these statements respectively are Democrats and Republicans for the most part. Like, I don't get usually a Republican who doesn't get the hypocrisy of gun control. Ultimately they do still believe in hypocritical gun control when they still believe in licensing and government permission for certain things, but it's a little bit more blatant with the Democrats. And the Republicans can usually point out the hypocrisy of the Democrats when it comes to guns. So I'll start with that one. This is probably the most glaring example for most people with so-called common sense. Democrats, rather, they say that they're anti-gun and they're anti-violence, but they believe in gun control. And you cannot facilitate gun control without guns and violence. A really easy, blatant example of that is an assault rifle ban. A Democrat who supports an assault rifle ban because he's noble and peaceful is failing to realize that the government needs guns in order to take other people's guns. And in the case of a so-called assault rifle ban, you're basically threatening violence on people just for owning a gun. They're not allowed to even have the gun, so you think agents of the state with their guns should go to this person's house and ultimately take it by force, and if they defend themselves, they should be shot. Now, Democrats and statists don't usually think their beliefs all the way through to the end, and if they do and you expose what the nature of it is, they'll rationalize it with some delusion or another. But that's a blatantly hypocritical belief right there, right? That you say you're against guns so much that you think that government agents with guns should go and threaten people who haven't threatened anyone. Like, just having an assault rifle is not threatening anyone. If that's the case, then nobody should even have handguns. You should ban all guns by that logic. And of course they'll say, well, we don't want to do that. We just want common sense laws. But there's nothing so-called common sense. There's nothing sensical about wanting the government to disarm you. It's just silliness. But another part of the Democrats, with their whole healthcare thing, they think they're so noble because they want to help the people have insurance and stuff. And they don't want people to die on the streets, but their whole argument is that government should force other people to do it. So it's like, again, if you think you're peaceful, but you think that government violence should be used against everybody in general to force them to pay into a general fund to give out to whoever, you're not really all that peaceful, are you? And it's just it's a strange perspective, the insurance and the healthcare thing, because they'll say, well, we don't want people to die on the street, but you should be forced to buy health insurance because we don't expect doctors to work for free. Well, that's the thing, is if you have the right to health care, then you shouldn't expect the doctors to be paid. If you have a right, if you have a right to be treated and have health care, then that means that you should have this done for free, which is kind of like how that is basically the belief. They just don't, because no sane person is really going to say doctors should not get paid for what they do, but that just contradicts their whole statement about how healthcare is a right. If you have a right, you don't have to pay somebody to get your rights, to exercise your rights, or to have your rights given to you, or like an obligation to you, a positive right where you are entitled to something, right? So, there's just a couple bits of hypocrisy right there. I'm sure there's a lot. If I actually sat down and wrote a list, it'd be really easy. But I just kind of doing this on the fly. So now let's move on to the Republicans. And I think that when it comes to the Republicans, it's just an overall general example, but it's a very deeply permeating example, and it goes really deep into the whole nature of the belief in government, in that a Republican they recognize that government doesn't have the right to force you to buy health insurance, but they do think that it has the right to force you to go and fight and die in a war. So they don't think that it has the right to force you to buy health care, but it has the right to basically make you sacrifice yourself to the state, which is just an outrageously glaring example of hypocrisy, which they don't even understand. I've never really seen that particular example given to many people aside from when I make the example. So they're not really thinking too much about that. Democrats aren't even. Oh, let me go back to the Democrats really quick. I've noticed in the news not that long ago, and on, I don't know, Facebook, some video, that's where I get most of my news these days, right? Is from Facebook memes. But I don't know, some woman in the service in the army or the military or something said, I don't need to listen to Trump about what the military needs. He's a draft dodger, basically. And I find it interesting that somebody would use draft dodger as an insult still, especially when Democrats, by and large, from my understanding, is that they're against the draft. The most sane people would be against the draft. I don't think you can believe in military conscription and be actually sane, but I think it's absurd to rail against the draft, as so many so-called leftists do, rightfully, but then throw draft dodger around as if it were an insult. I mean, that only is an insult to a person who thinks slavery can be legitimate, who thinks it can be legitimate and it's justified and rightful that the state order you to go participate in mortal combat. So obviously they're not thinking that one through. And the Republicans, another thing, just even with the gun control laws, they say everyone has the right to bear arms, but they still, in a lot of ways, believe in licensing and registration for certain types of weapons. And, that doesn't make any sense. That's contradictory. And a bit of rhetoric that the Democrats like to use, the Republicans rather, which I haven't seen that much lately because it's just, the television has got everybody worked up into so much nonsense that they're not even coming close to making rational arguments, which both sides can actually make good arguments sometimes when it comes to particular issues. Like the Democrats are usually pretty solid. The common folk, no offense or anything, but as opposed to the higher ups and the political overlords and stuff, mostly seem to be against the drug war. They can't really articulate why, because they don't understand the nature of liberty in government. But they understand something's wrong with putting people in cages for smoking weed, and if you press them, they probably could articulate because they're not hurting anyone else. And right, that's the whole point. But that's a big contradiction when it comes to Republicans too. Is they also seem to, a lot of them, the hardcore so-called conservatives, they're either against the war on drugs and they think it's okay to put people in cages for doing drugs, even though they're not hurting anyone else. Or they are just so brainwashed that they just support it because it's law, which is basically what every statist believes. But I don't know, I'm kind of going off on a rant. I'm kind of losing it now. But, that's basically just a couple points there of hypocrisy that Democrats and Republicans have. They're not making any sense. The belief in government doesn't make any sense. The statists will always contradict themselves. And as you drift further and further away from the cult of statism, it's easier and easier to pinpoint their contradictions. On both sides, even your former beliefs, it's really easy to see where your beliefs weren't really making any sense and were not consistent with reality once you step out of that group and listen to everything that they're actually saying. It doesn't make any type of sense. They always contradict themselves. But yeah, so anyway, peace and abolish the state.